Concepts and Protocols for Advanced Mand Training for Students with Autism by Mike Miklos. Miklos? Okay. I've known him for a couple years now, and I haven't had to clarify that. A few announcements before we get started. The exhibit hall is open today until 5. There's a quiet rooms in room 113, 114 if anybody needs that. The nursing room is 116, and there's a patent pod that's new this year in room 115, so please go there and share your experience. Amaris and Mike will be presenting a special session this afternoon. It's titled Not Just Autism, Generic Extension of Effective Practice Across Special Education Settings, and that's today from 4:30 to 6 in President's Hall. And remember to continue your education credits. You must complete and hand in the verification form at the registration desk prior to departing on your last day of attendance. This is where you put those codes that you're getting at the end of each session. And you can access the PowerPoint of the handouts via the session on the conference website. And we're also asking you that you complete the, at the end of each session, give us some feedback on the conference website as well. So I'm here to introduce Mike, and I've known Mike for a couple years now, and it's a fascinating path that we've gone through together. First time I met Mike it was a phone call. I was a worried parent. My daughter's on the spectrum, and I just, we had some concerns, and he said, yeah, it's worth doing. I'm going to pursue that, and I'm going to see what I can do about helping out. And calling up somebody like Mike, who I've only seen in videos online, it's like such a powerful thing to say, okay, I didn't think we were actually going to be able to even reach him on the phone, much less have him say, yeah, I'll be there next week and I'll go and help out. So that was like the first introduction. And then I met him again, and he was just so powerful and energetic and so happy about what we're doing. And he was like, yeah, it's all about the kids. And he kept reiterating that, and I felt that. I knew he meant it, but I had a different background, a different history, where when people said that, I didn't always, I was a little on edge and cautious about that. And so when Mike says it, I believe it. I kind of that continuously got reinforced for me, that it is about the kids, it's about teaching. And I see him either going out and doing boot camps, and there's hundreds of people and teachers, and he's pushing this information, the system out that is really proven, it's data driven, and he believes it, and it really does work. And without his efforts, none of this would be where it is today. So that's a really powerful thing. So I've had the honor of working with Mike on one-on-one basis, or working with him and Amaris one-on-one or one-on-two, and we're basically, it's amazing to see how much passion is there and how much he's able to break this difficult subject matter down into something so simple that anybody can get, and a parent even too. So that's the part that I think is amazing. And even though this is advanced in an intermediate class for Manding, I'm so excited about being here because Mands is the core of what we're doing here. So to see Mike come up here and present this is, to me, a special piece of this presentation. And just, I wanted to give like one anecdote about where we've been is, I asked Mike one time, can I shadow you and just follow you around to a couple of different schools? And he's like, sure, next Thursday is great. I have a light load. It's only 4 schools. So I'm like, 4 schools? That seems like a fairly, that's not a light load. But I was like, okay, that's great. And we met. We're driving together in the car. I'm using that also as an opportunity to always ask questions and to get more information from him, because it's always a wealth of information. And 2 of those schools, the moment, there was something that just happened in those schools that just were epiphany moments for me. One of those schools, we go in, and there's a student who had 0 expressive language, nothing. And this is a student who's in a classroom, and they're trying to do everything they can, and we go in, and one of our colleagues is already working with them, and within a couple hours, he's already taught them 3 Mands. This is a student who had no expressive language. He's already manding. He's already getting expression out there. Mike's working with the staff. He's teaching them. He's going through the book. All of this stuff is happening, and it's amazing how many things that are juggling and going on that are being directed in the right direction. It's always a nudge to get us into the right direction. So I just felt like, wow, this student just had an amazing impact on this one day to go in that direction. Mike's coming back and he's on cloud nine. He's so excited. And then we go to another classroom and there's a student there and he's struggling with the sign for lion. And we keep doing it, but he's saying he's lion. And then the parent comes over and says, well, what do I do? How do I get this sign? How do I shape it better? And Mike's like, well, I don't know if we have to sign it. Maybe we can just do the echoics now. And this is a student who just had emerging echoics, and he just started getting there. And within 10 minutes, Mike transformed this program from a sign-based program to an echoic-based program because the student had those skills and they had developed, because the staff was working so hard and they had really gotten him to a place where he was ready for that. So, he did like a blind tacting fluency, something that really got us into the right, he proved that it was right without us, just jumping to conclusions. And by doing that, it was just so powerful to see that changed that student's life. And whether if he's doing boot camps and he's changing the lives of all the instructors or paras or teachers or admin or SLPs, or he's going down into one-on-one with a student and seeing how their skills are developing and working on their program, there's a whole spectrum of how you make a change in this industry, and I've seen Mike do it on all levels. So that to me is just an amazing thing, and that goes back to, it is all about the kids, and he's convinced me of that. And he's, as a parent of a child with autism, I actually have so much more confidence in the world of ABA because of Mike. So it's just so powerful to see him do that. So without any more, Mike, come on up and let's enjoy this.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Dean. That's a great honor hearing it from you. You got to hear Dean speak on Thursday morning. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but he's helping us develop some software to guide intensive teaching, and Dean's brilliance is going to change a lot of lives in the state and hopefully elsewhere with his applications. Thank you. It's humbling to be here and to be able to give this presentation. I hope it's helpful to you in your work on a day-to-day basis. Before I start, I want to make one comment, though, that I think is important. This same talk was given, I think, 2 years ago at this conference by David Roth. I would encourage you to watch his live stream of it, which is available online as well. He covers different topics and different concepts that are important to this issue and will add to many of the things I'm saying. There are certain additional things that we wanted to get across, and that's the reason why we're doing this presentation another time, to augment and extend some of David's presentation and to give a little different perspective. I think his session is also very much worth watching. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to start talking about the Mand. And the Mand is this beautiful little piece of behavior that we all engage in. We all will go up to somebody and say something, we'll ask for something under the conditions where there's something we want. As a result of saying it, something good happens. We get what we ask for. It's this just beautiful little interaction that is so powerful in terms of all of our repertoires. We mand almost constantly. It's a central part of almost all of our social lives. Okay? My okay just now was a mand. Yeah, you got what I'm saying, okay? I'm looking for some specific reinforcement. We mand without thinking. It's effortless to us until it isn't. And frequently what we see with individuals with autism spectrum disorders is the Mand repertoire fails to develop to a level at which they are effective in controlling their social environments. What I want to point out today is that simple relation between wanted, say it, get it, actually is a lot more complex than what we think. It's often an area that is challenging for us to teach and requires a careful analysis of interaction and an integrated approach to looking at what variables are in play that we can use to teach a child to better ask for what they want. I want to give a little word of caution before I start, though. This is not going to be a research presentation. I'm not going to be backing up what I say with data. There is a lot of data out there in relation to some of the protocols. I think those of you who were lucky enough to hear Alice Schillingsberg yesterday heard some of the basic research related to verbal behavior, including some of her work and the work of her colleagues on the Mands. So I'm not going to be doing that. And some of the protocols I'm going to be talking about are basically things we are doing in applied settings because we have to. There isn't research out there yet, and we have children who are missing skills, and we have to respond to those issues. And those kind of circumstances require an interpretive approach to figuring things out and doing something that's practical. And what this means is we have to take the scientific principles that exist, the data that has been shown to guide basic relations, and extend it into areas that there isn't clear evidence on what to do yet. If you look at some of the scientific phenomena that exist, in terms of issues such as the moon. Why is the moon in place? Okay, and how does the moon affect events on Earth, like the tides? Well, everybody would say, yes, the tides are caused by the gravitational influence of the moon, but yet that has never been proven. How would you prove that? You'd have to take away the moon and see if the tides go away, and then bring the moon back and see, and you can't do that. But yet we all know that the moon's going over the Earth creates a gravitational pull and causes this slogging in the middle of the ocean, and that has ripple effects out to the side in terms of wave formation. That kind of interpretation is completely consistent with laws of science that have been established. In our practice as teachers and people who are concerned about children developing skills that will help them be independent in life, there are times where we're going to need to apply that same kind of interpretive principle, where we need to say, well, here's how the principles of reinforcement work. Here are how the basic principles of man training that are established work. What are the conditions under which we need to teach this in this circumstance for this child? We need to be reasonable in our approach, but we also need to be sensitive to current conditions. And that indeed involves an interpretive approach. So a lot of what I'm going to be saying is going to relate to that type of approach. Okay, so the Mand has a basic relation. Technically, the antecedent to a pure Mand is what's called a motivating operation. And a motivating operation, as you're aware, is a change in environmental circumstances that alter the value of a reinforcer and have an evocative effect, lead to a response becoming more likely. And in simple language, when there's something that changes, that alters needing something or wanting something, you do something, and as a result, that thing appears. The Mand is socially oriented. You have to interact with another person because that's what makes it verbal. Your behaviors, the consequences of your behavior are mediated by listeners who have, been shaped to respond to your Mand. And I'll talk more about that as we go. And the consequences for the Mand are direct. You want something, you say it, and you get what you ask for. That is the basic relation in a Mand. The Mand then could be said to specify its reinforcer. And the point I'm getting at here, though, that is going to be important throughout this training, the definition I just gave suggests that the Mand is under control of pure motivation. In the condition where you're hungry, where you haven't had food, food becomes valuable, and you're likely to say something to get food. In that condition, the Mand appears purely out of the idea that you're hungry, that you haven't had food for a while. Well, in most cases, that's not really how the Mand works. I will ask somebody to share their food with me because we're in a social situation. We're eating together, and it's a polite thing to do. There are times where I've just had a big meal, and I see a piece of candy that is sweet, and I'll ask somebody for a piece of candy, even though I'm not primarily hungry at that point. There are many subtle variables that alter the tendency to Mand that go well beyond pure motivation. Most Mands are really multiply controlled. There are multiple things going on that lead us to Mand. Let me show you a video here that I'll show again at the end of this training for another purpose. There's one Mand in here, and I'll sort of talk through it as it's playing. And I want you to consider what is the just look at this Mand and ask, where did this Mand come from? How did the child, or how did this young adult learn to emit this Mand? So here he is. He's the teacher taught a procedure in which he has learned to make coffee, to sell coffee to other people in the school. And he takes the order, he reads the order, he goes up to the Keurig, he's going through all the steps necessary to make the coffee. He had read the order, and reading the order, there was no creamer available. You can see him looking around for the creamer now. This is a motivative change. He's searching around. Where is it? Having that creamer would be a strong reinforcer because it would help him complete the chain of events. The coffee's almost done. There's no creamer. Oh, what's this guy going to do? He gets the stick. He's still looking. He's trying to problem solve. There's no readily available reinforcer, but he's trying to figure it out, looking around, looking. The motivation continues to build. Oh, where is it? Is it under here? Nope, not there. He turns and says, where are the creamers? He asks the paraprofessional in the classroom, and as a result, he's told where the creamers are and gets them. How is that? I could tell you this guy was not able to ask that kind of question before. He was unable to emit that Mand. How was it taught? Well, there are several options that could have been kicked in to teach it. Somebody could have directly told him, no creamers, ask for the creamers, and directly prompted him. There could have been repeated trials and lots of practice where you keep the creamers away and he asks for the creamers to get the creamers. There could have been a more complex way of teaching it through what's called an interrupted chain, where you teach him to respond to getting one step done, another step done, and then if there's any breaks in that chain, you can prompt him to ask for what is missing in that chain of events to get something done. Perhaps you could also do what would be called a tack to Mand transfer, where you teach him to label all the parts in the activity, and then when there's motivation for any part, he can ask for it. There are multiple options for getting that individual to the point where he could emit that mand. The question is, which one was it? Well, we'll get to that a little bit later. The point is that once a child has a repertoire, has developed a set of skills, you can't always tell how it was taught. But yet, the important thing is that how things are learned and how they are taught are critically important to the process of getting individuals who are missing certain repertoires to have those repertoires. We need to be concerned about the procedures. How are we going to teach? Well, as I mentioned before, this is a much more complicated procedure than teaching many other skills. Why? Because first of all, Mands involve motivation. If we're going to teach, we have to set up circumstances where a child wants something. That means we're going to have to manipulate motivation. But aside from that, there's a second issue, and that issue is pure Mands that are controlled solely by motivation are rare. In that circumstance you just saw in the video, it wasn't just wanting creamers and saying creamers. All of these other variables had to come together to control the timing of the mand. He had to know it was the creamers that was missing, and then that motivation had to rise. He had to know that creamers weren't available. When he manded, he had to know where to go get the creamers. There were a myriad of variables related to emitting that mand. And without a systematic approach to addressing all of those component aspects of the mand, he wouldn't have been able to do it. Luckily, his teacher, who did a beautiful job with this, taught all those component skills and didn't look solely at the I want, I say, I get process. She included other components of instruction, and I will get to those as we go. So basically, these complex interactions of the mand often involve previously acquired tact components, and the tact is simply a verbal operant in which you sense something in the environment, you emit a verbal response that says what you're seeing, and there is non-specific reinforcement. So in the situation where I see some coffee creamers, I look at them and say, coffee creamers. And whoever I'm talking to looks at me and goes, yeah, they're coffee creamers. The motivation for tacting is different than the motivation for manding. In the tact frame, you say something because it benefits the speaker. The speaker responds to what you're saying by looking at the object or responding to the sensory stimulus in a fashion that would be different than what they otherwise would have done. And the tact also requires sort of a cultural background. The reason I call it coffee is because somebody taught me to say coffee. If I was in the Czech Republic, I would say kava. Yeah, okay? So my behavior of saying coffee has been shaped up by an English-speaking community. Okay, the point I'm getting at here is that tact repertoire, when it becomes sufficiently developed, may have implications for learning the mand. That's another point I'm going to be making in this presentation and some of the procedures to promote that. Mands are often modified. We could mand for things that we want and get what we say. So in the case where I want an apple, I say apple, I get apple. But the circumstances under which we ask for apples are different. There are times where we may be hungry and an apple would be valuable, and we look over to somebody and we say, could I have an apple, please? And the person gives us the apple because we politely asked. There might be a situation where you're cooking something and the pot's about to overboil and you need to get the apple in there right away to cool the water down. And you look over to somebody who's helping you out and you say, apple! It's the same Mand. In both situations, you say apple to get apple. But in the second case, you're altering the effect your Mand has on the listener by the change in tone, or by the words you use. Perhaps you say, give me an apple, get an apple, where those extra words control the listener in a little subtly different way. These are Mand extensions. These are Mands that alter the primary Mands for some way that allow the listener to get to you, to get you the reinforcement in a slightly different way. That kind of control is really important for children to establish. And it's something we see often in autism support classrooms when people are teaching Mands. We teach Mands in a way that ends up with this rote, I always say it this way and I always get it. I always say, I want apple, please. And there's no subtle control of the listener, as most sophisticated speakers would admit when talking to somebody and asking for things. And the question is, how do we overcome that? How do we get to teach a child to emit these subtle changes in response that are so powerful in controlling a listener? So I will also get to that in a little bit. But how do we teach it? How do we do that? We'll get there on that. I think that process has to do, however, with some of the very earliest steps in Mands training. When we are looking at how most of us develop Mands, how most of us learn to ask other people for what we want, right from the get-go, right from the earliest points of infancy, our acquisition of Mands are highly complex. There's so much going on. If you think about it, and the print is so small here, I apologize for it, but you have this situation in which an adult, perhaps the mother, goes up and repeatedly presents some reinforcing event, a little bite of food or a tickle or some strange event like a baby appearing from behind a blanket. And this is done repeatedly. Well, what's got to happen for the child to learn to say tickle or blanket, way down the road, of course, is the first thing the baby has to emit an observational response. And this is consistent with some of the work that Francesca Delia Espinosa was talking about the other day. The idea here is that what the baby will do is has to look and see the event. There has to be some kind of visual regard so the baby comes in contact with that stimulus event, with that configuration. Then, once the baby is looking at it, the adult has to present some characteristic verbal response that will later somehow get into the baby's repertoire. So when the parent is tickling, they're not just tickling. They might be doing finger motions before tickle, 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 and they might be saying a tickle, tickle, which requires another level of responsiveness from the infant. The baby has to hear that response. It has to hit the baby's ears and then and be correlated with the event. So the baby has to be watching, the baby has to hear the sound that then goes with the pleasurable interaction with another person. The baby hears the sound while reaching and obtaining the item. And that results in some kind of conditioning process, meaning that that sound of hearing tickle while being tickled takes on reinforcing characteristics. It goes with it. But that's not all. Since the baby has likely hopefully at some point, is emitting varied babbling kind of behavior, emitting a range of sounds perhaps. Some of those sounds will perhaps match what they are hearing from the parent. And then what happens when they say tick, 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 the tickle comes in at that point. And somehow the parent is selecting out which sounds are closer. But there's another process going on here. The baby is emitting a variety of sounds. If the baby only emits one sound, you're never going to get a Mand repertoire to develop. There's a complexity here of development where you need a range of sounds that are being emitted. And then the sounds that match what the parent said in the condition where the child is responding specifically to the reinforcer that is available at the time, under conditions under which this has been fun. In other words, motivation has been set up by the parent. You get all that done, then tick, 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 the baby saying something like that begins to emerge as a Mand. The point is, this is pretty complex. It's a pretty complex relationship right from infancy. And that many of these components have to be taken into place when we're shaping up Mands. Here is one of those earliest phases here, and you're going to see a little infant here who is playing with her mother, and I hope this video works. Yeah.
Ready? Here it comes. Look over here. Ready?
The baby, you see all those components I was just talking about. The baby has to look, see the ring, see that it's coming from the mother. The mother is talking and making sounds. And the baby, in that gleeful laughter that you can't help smiling. I've watched this a million times and I always smile when I hear it. It's contagious. But the baby's producing sounds. The baby is producing sounds that allow the raw material for the mother to more specifically respond to. Okay, so here is the same little girl a little bit later. I don't know if that audio is clear enough, but it's exactly what I was talking about earlier. Tick, 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 tick. You hear the baby making this repeated vocalization. Those vocalizations were practiced in two ways. One is in an echoic framework, when the mother says tickle, the baby goes tick. But there's another way. That baby, when anybody who's been around babies very long, if you let them alone for a little bit, they often play with the period of like jargon when they're producing all these sounds that sounds speech-like. And what's going on is when it's, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, when it sounds right, the baby says it more. So tick, tick, tick becomes stronger. It's what happens in a cultural language. I was lucky enough to be in China recently, and somebody, I was talking about echoic behavior, and I asked somebody from China to have me say something in Chinese, and it was impossible for me to say it. Likewise, when I said something in English to somebody who's speaking Mandarin, it was extremely hard for them to say it. Why? Because our experiences when we were infants, when we were acquiring language, were entirely different. I played around, and when the sounds my mother made sounded right, those are the sounds that I produced more often. My friend from Beijing, when they heard the more tonal sounds from their language, they sounded right and were more likely to produce them. Okay, here is the same little girl a little bit later, and this mother happens to be a behavior analyst who works with a lot of children with autism, and had taught her blue for blueberry along with the vocal, of course. But you'll see the first formal mand being emitted here. And the point here is that the form of the mand really doesn't matter. It's these relations that shape it up. So there the baby made a vocalization. It was a not quite intelligible, it was sort of a generalized, yeah, kind of thing to get what she wants. But then she signs blue, and
Blueberries.
the mother pairs the response of giving the blueberry with the vocal response. That will strengthen the tendency for the baby to say blue later. Okay, here's the same girl at a much older period. Okay, and I'm not going to show all of this, but it's Christmas morning, and there's an empty plate of cookies at the fireplace. I don't know if you heard that. I'm sorry the audio wasn't good. She turns around and goes, "Where's Santa? Where's Santa?" Notice the level of complexity in just this year. This child has, she's not quite 2 there, so before age 2, this child has gone to the point, where's Santa? That is way different than asking for blueberry. Blueberry, the item present, say blueberry, get blueberry. Much different than the mother being over, tickle, say tickle, to get tickle. Now, the relations that are necessary to do that, to say, where's Santa? I mean, it's one of the most beautiful things that we can imagine about human behavior. How do we get to that point? That complex ability to demand for information. She's not asking for Santa. She's asking to know where Santa went after he ate the cookies. That is a complex set of behaviors. How do we get children to do that? How do we take children who have autism and are unable to emit such behavior to move systematically towards being able to do exactly that? That's a challenge. And I'm not sure I'm going to have answers for all these questions for you. And some of the answers I have are going to be approximate. Okay, but just bear with me here. So as I said, here's all this stuff that goes on. There's a socially mediated event. Somebody's interacting with you and establishes value. You have joint attention. You have gaze shifting. The reinforcer has to be valuable. In other words, there's a motivating operation in place. The access to that reinforcer has to initially be controlled by the listener. It can't come from the environment, otherwise the child wouldn't, from other aspects of the environment, otherwise the child wouldn't ask. If I can get a drink of coffee by reaching over here and getting the coffee on my own, I'm not going to ask Dean to get me a cup of coffee. Okay? So there has to be that social mediation. You also have to acquire the response topography. I have to be able to say coffee or sign coffee. I have to have the topography necessary to control my listener. I need to be able to discriminate, and this is an important thing we don't consider either. I have to be able to discriminate when the listener is likely to reinforce me. Just think, and I use this example in some of our intensive skill trainings. You go into a restaurant, and you don't walk in and say, I'll take a hamburger with a lettuce, tomato, and cheese and ketchup on that. You don't go in and do that right away. If it's a sit-down restaurant, you wait until the conditions are, you've been seated, you have the menu, the waiter comes over, the wait staff comes over and says, can I help you? That's when demand occurs for the hamburger. It doesn't occur randomly in time. There's got to be this building of the right stimulus conditions that'll evoke demand. It's an important consideration for teaching these skills. We may also need to have a child who, if they have developed that topography, that ability to ask for what they want, we may need a situation in which the adult has learned to prompt the behavior effectively. The adult has learned to be able to get the topography to occur. For many children early on, this involves shaping up either an echoic repertoire for vocal responders or an imitative repertoire for signed responders, for those who are responding in sign language. Prompts need to be faded. Another important consideration. Once you get the child to emit the behavior under the right conditions of motivation and you've prompted demand, you need to fade demand. And while we're working on this, we have to maintain the value of the reinforcers so the child is getting enough practice asking for it. If you don't get enough practice asking for something, you're not going to get the skill into the repertoire. All of this needs to also be concerned with the issue of making sure that there's enough practice, that there's enough generality so the child is learning to ask for whatever they're interested in a wide variety of settings. A main point I'm hoping to get across here is that this process of I want it, I say it, I get it, is tied to a range of environmental considerations that need to be put in place in our instructional protocols. We need to consider these things when we're teaching. But I also want to emphasize something as I go. You can't change all these variables at once. You have to build systematically. So here's another part of this Mand development, an older child acquiring a Mand. So once you have a child who has developed one Mand or several Mands, it generally leads to the child having the ability to echo parental or other people interacting with them, their vocalizations under conditions of motivation. So they learn to say what other people say to them during these periods of wanting something. And then in that situation, generally the child has probably also learned not only to echo what other people say, but they've probably acquired some degree of ability to tact at that point, to tell people what they see. Okay? And that occurs fairly earlier. A child will see a dog and say, "Doggy!" in order to direct somebody's attention to the doggy. And there, the reinforcer isn't getting the dog, it's getting the social attention for telling the person there's a dog there and the shared laughter that comes. Okay? So that kind of tact acquisition occurs pretty early. With that said, once the child has tact skills and echoic skills, it doesn't take much for the situation to change where the child wants the dog and says doggy to get dog. That kind of transfer can occur much more readily in older learners. And that's a central part of advanced Mand training. What we often see in classrooms who have set up really nice programs for teaching initial Mand repertoires is teachers freeze. They get the child to, in the condition where they have lots of stuff up front, they have a cookie and they hold up the cookie, the child says cookie and gets cookie. They then hold up the Pokemon doll, the child says Pokemon and they get it. They ask for the videos, and the child learns to ask for all this stuff. And the teacher says, "Oh, we're done with Mand training." Well, what happens, though, when the child wants something they've never asked for before but they can name? Have we had procedures to allow the child to learn to develop skills from their speaking loosely, their vocabulary of naming things, to asking for what they want? That becomes the next step. Here's a video of some advanced Manding in a very, very young child. I'm forgetting how old she is in this video. But this is Willow Hozella's daughter. You'll hear Willow. Delightful. Having fun with yogurt.
You want more?
And there was a whole lot of generalization that occurred there. More tea. She had learned to tack tea. She could look at things, what is it, tea? And here, under conditions of motivation, she wants her tea out of a little cup. She says tea and she gets tea. The tact transferred to the Mand at a very early stage. Notice that in that situation, her manding was controlled by the motivation to get more tea, to wash down some of that yogurt that was both in her and on her. But it was also controlled by Willow asking her if she wanted it. What do you want? Okay, there was lots of different things going on. Almost all Mands have that degree of multiple control. When I'm talking about multiple control, what I'm saying is that the situations that occur before we do something have complex components. So that in the situation where I pick up my glasses to see the screen, that motivation is established by my finishing saying something and needing to remind myself what I'm going to say again, looking at the screen, not being able to see it, and then looking down, seeing my glasses, pulling up my... There are so many components to the antecedent that occur prior to my doing this. The situation in which we ask for something out of the blue is pretty rare. The bulk of this presentation, I hope, is going to talk about those issues related to shaping up multiply controlled Mands. That's where I'm hoping to go with this information. But you got to start somewhere. And most of us in our interventions are going to start with some of those basic Mand training programs. And what is the basic procedure for teaching a Mand? And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Teaching students to make a request is a central focus of ABA efforts. Why? Because the deficits in individuals who have autism are directly related to social communicative functioning. If we can teach children to approach another person and say something to control their social environment, we are hitting head on one of the core deficits in this disorder, and maybe setting up a child to be able to have a skill set that can expand exponentially over time. And we're knocking out several things in this process. We're establishing the value of interacting with another person, the value of speaking, and we're teaching a repertoire of communication skills, the child being able to say the name of a particular item in order to get it, along with teaching flexibility. When I want apple, I say apple. When I want doggy, I say doggy. So this is a central skill to teach. The basics of teaching a Mand. And there have been many sessions at this training or at this conference over the years that have covered this. But the basic idea is the first thing you do is you manipulate motivation. You figure out something that the child is going to value that you can deliver. You can deliver it quickly, you can deliver it repeatedly, and you can deliver it in small enough amounts that the child will come up to you to get it repeatedly. You then pair delivery of that item with the listener. The child learns to come up to you, so the child wants tickles, and you tickle. Tickle, 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 tickle. And the child learns this relation. I go up and I get tickle. And you're also then at that point pairing the response form that the child will use with delivery of the item. So the child is hearing tickle as they're getting tickled. They're hearing ball as their ball is being thrown to them. You then, once the child has learned to do that, you then fade your prompts. Or you start prompting, excuse me. You prompt the child to give the response. So you have to, in basic Mand training, make sure that you have an effective prompt. For vocal responders, it has to be an echoic prompt. You have to have a child who can repeat what you say when you say it. For students who are signing, You either have to have a child who will accept a physical prompt, physically shaping the movements that will serve as demand, or have imitative skills so they could imitate the movements. But you need to have a prompt. The next step is once you prompt demand, you fade demand. Okay? You fade your prompt so that eventually just the item present and the motivation to get it control the child saying ball, to get the ball. Okay? And then you teach man discrimination. You can't only have one mand going in basic mand training. Otherwise, that one mand will become generalized and serve to control lots of different things. So you teach a child candy to get a bit of candy, and that's the only mand you taught. What do they do when they want a hug? They sign candy. Okay? We have to teach multiple mands to get that discrimination. In the presence of wanting candy, I say candy. In the presence of wanting ball, I say ball. That's part of a teaching arrangement that establishes good man skills. Once you have several mands going, you also have to be able to correct errors when they occur. In the process of practicing to ask for the things you want, errors are going to occur. You have to have a well-developed error correction. And then you have to shape these mand responses across an entire repertoire of mands, across mands for not only items that are directly present, but for items that are missing, items that are actions rather than things, asking for missing items, asking for people to attend to asking for your listener to attend somewhere. Look, you're going to need to shape a whole range of mands. Here's a video of some of those basic mand procedures. And I'm using this video because it shows Willow Hosella basically running some really nice training procedures. And you'll see it break down. You'll see that what he's doing doesn't work initially. But he does some nice training on this basic procedure.
Now we're going to try a second.
So basically what he did before this video started is he provided a prompt for, I think it's cereal here, and she responded cereal to get the cereal. Now he's trying to fade his prompt with what's called a second trial transfer. So he said cereal. She said cereal. He gave cereal. He holds it up again, and that's what he's looking to see happen here is, will she say cereal the second time without the prompt? And you'll see that she doesn't.
Trial transfer. Oh, there. Don't do second trial transfers, problem. Cookie.
Oh, it's cookie. I'm sorry.
Cookie.
So the second trial didn't work, so he went back to prompting her, getting her to sign cookie after a prompt, and his prompt was an imitative prompt. That time he transferred to a lesser prompt. Now he's going to try another prompt fading technique here.
I'm going to try within trial for this one.
And this is called a within trial transfer.
Prompt first. Cracker.
And that didn't work. She made an error. Okay. What he was looking to do there was he holds up the cracker. Cracker. She imitates him. She takes the prompt. And then he moved it closer, which would be a little bit of extinction effect, which should lead her to sign cracker again. Extinction meaning that a reinforcer that had previously been delivered is no longer delivered and leads to the behavior fading. In extinction, what happens is sometimes you get variation or you get changes in magnitude. He was hoping for a change in magnitude that she would again sign cracker, but he got variation. She changed to another sign. So that didn't work either. So he runs a little error correction procedure.
In trial, you might get errors. We got errors on the second trial until I did a repeated prompts. Doesn't mean it has cracker.
And there, what he did, and that's the last part, is he went to a partial prompt. Okay, so he did this. Yeah, this video is really well done. Willow's like training somebody else how to do that. It's pretty cool to see somebody being able to work with the child at the same time he's tacting his own behavior. It's really pretty impressive. Hooray for Willow. But it shows all the basics of man training there. Okay. The problem is, and what you see when you see a video like that is it looks sort of contrived. It looks sort of like, oh, he's sitting at the table giving her food at the table, and it's back and forth, and it's not really how we manned. Well, as I said, establishing initial manned repertoire for some students is going to involve those very procedures, and those procedures can be very effective. But absolutely, that's not all that's involved, and you can't end there. They're only a tool to get the repertoire established so you can extend it to other circumstances and other positions in which the mand will be necessary. So, when we're talking about advanced manding, any mands beyond the kind of circumstance you saw, and even for those mands, the processes become a little different in terms of your setup. Any of you who have been involved in our intensive skill training or receiving consultation in classrooms know that we advise people to schedule instruction. Scheduling instruction so that dense opportunities to learn a skill are available is critical. It's not something superfluous, it's critical. One of the things we recommend is that we include a schedule involving manned training sessions. Well, once you get into more complicated mands, you need to do two things. You need to provide more distributed practices. So you'll schedule manned trials that are embedded across a range of activities. It can't always be an at-the-table set period of 15 minutes of manding. You're going to have to distribute it more. You're also going to have to arrange situations that allow the man to occur under the complex, naturally occurring situations in which demand will occur. For instance, what you saw in the video with the coffee cart and asking for the creamer, that couldn't be scheduled. Okay, we're going to do the creamer now. No, you have to do it when the order for the coffee came in. In that situation, somebody came in and needed a coffee order, and a student had to respond to those circumstances at the right time. Goes back to that timing issue I mentioned earlier. You have to be able to man not only under the right motivation, not only under the conditions when it's available, but also under the right times in terms of a listener. So the idea here is train mans across settings, across time and locations. Another thing you want to be considering in your man training is this idea of indiscriminable contingencies. What that means is you're going to provide opportunities to practice manding when the child doesn't expect it. All of a sudden, the child is working on some task, and all of a sudden something appears that's valuable to the child, and the child has to ask for it in that situation. That allows the child to begin developing flexibility when they're going to mand. Too many at-the-table, uncontrolled mands will set up a circumstance that the child learns to ask only in conditions when they're at the table. So getting mands distributed throughout the day and at times when the child doesn't expect them is important. We also need to teach the mand under the conditions when it's going to be necessary, during things such as activities of daily living, during various leisure play activities, when interacting with peers, and in situations that require problem solving. And like I said, a problem is when there's something of value and there's no immediate response that will get that reinforcer, so you have to generate other responses, such as you saw in the video. And this man training has to be integrated into a range of relevant conditions that involve complex verbal behavior. In other words, once the mand gets developed at the level you saw Willow shaping, I want the cracker, I say cracker, I get cracker, other verbal operants begin entering into the issue. And I'll talk about how it relates to intraverbals, hopefully near the end of this session. I already talked about this, so I'm not going to talk too much about this other than to say, remember that you're going to get distributed practice and you can embed man training into other circumstances. This complex manned behavior can be looked at as a hierarchical sequence of man's skills. Here is a list of those possible permutations on the mand. Manding for items that are present. Manding for items that are present using either a vocal or signed response or through some selection-based system. Mands for negation, telling somebody, no, I don't want that, take that away. Mands for an item that's not present, asking for something that is missing in a sequence. Mands for attention. Mands for actions, asking somebody to do something. Mands is part of a problem-solving situation. Mands for information. When I say a mands for information, I'm referring to a circumstance where the child is going to ask for reinforcement in the form of somebody else's verbal behavior. Where is the clicker? I looked at Dean, and I'm not getting the clicker. What Dean is saying to me, hey, it's on the table. And when Dean says on the table, it directs me to look at the table. My primary motivation is for Dean to tell me something, his verbal behavior, an important set of skills to teach. And then mands for things like information in a conversation. Yeah, where'd you go last night? And how'd you get the car when it was pouring rain? You know, and your interest there is on the person talking to you and telling stories and providing you with verbal responses that have a reinforcing characteristic in and of themselves. There's also mands for continued conversation. The is often a mand. Tell me more. Okay? Those are all a sequence of mands that are complex and part of all of our repertoires. So there's one more basic point I want to get at here before I move on. And that is, there's an idea some people have that, ABA is only for children who have very limited skill sets, and it's this very simplistic training model. Well, as far as I know, the research seems to, when we're talking about large-scale meta-analyses of studies that have been done that show effective outcomes, I don't see that behavior analysis is not the treatment of choice across levels of functioning. The issue is we have to figure out how to solve those issues. One of the things that happens for students who have developed a range of verbal skills and who may be quite competent at certain academic skills, one of the things that happens is most frequently they are in circumstances in classes in which a defective manned repertoire interferes with their adjustment. In other words, they mand too much. They mand too strongly. They show strong reactions to not being able to receive a reinforcer when they mand. In other words, being told no sets them off. And it's those problem behaviors that end up in office referrals and children not having access to instruction that might otherwise be at the appropriate level. And we don't address that. We don't teach children who have such patterns of performance manding. Our society doesn't think of that as a set of skills, but it's important. What we have seen is for many students that as we teach manned responding, as we teach the child to control their social environment through asking for what they want, we see this beautiful decline in problem behavior. Okay? Now, for higher functioning students, that's going to involve teaching them to read another person. When can that person respond to you? When is that person likely to respond to you? What is it about their facial expression that allows that kind of opportunity to mand. How do you teach a child to engage in behaviors such as being able to wait for a reinforcer? We teach that pretty early in the programs we're consulting with. But many students, many children, none of us in this room, of course, fail to learn to be able to wait for what they want. My guess is that, many of you, when you're in restaurants or in a store or something, you see somebody rudely cut in line and say, I want this, we think, oh my gosh, that person's rude. Well, what makes the behavior rude? It's a defective mand. They're not timing their mand. They don't know the skill of waiting for the reinforcer. There are many students who can't accept no. And how do we teach a child how have we learned to be able to respond without behaving aggressively when we're told we can't have something for which we have motivation? We've all learned that. How did we learn it? I would say that it's not something that emerges naturally out of our genetic heritage to have social reciprocity or something. I think it's an idea that comes from our having learned that if somebody tells us no, well, we'll shift to another reinforcer. We'll shift to something else. We'll find another way of going about addressing our motivation. And people have directly taught us. We may not remember that being taught, but it has probably happened. So, the protocol for accepting no is simply you present something to the child, something that is valuable, not too valuable at first. You start small. You present something that's not too valuable. The child asks for it because they have a history of manding when they want something. And you simply say, no, you can't have that, but you can have this. And you hold up something that's of equal value. The child wants that, you give it to them. The child has learned that it's not so bad to say no because something else happens. And then through a process of fading in conditions, you extend how much time occurs between being told no and the appearance of another reinforcer, and also how much time extends between being told no, that they can't have this, and it coming back. So what I might do first, hold this up, child asks for it, say, no, you can't have that, but you can have this. Child accepts, gets this one, and you can have this. They get the other one back right away. And then you're just fading across the variables of time between return to the availability of asking for what they want, as well as the strength of motivation for the initial item. You're going to start with things that aren't the child's biggest kahuna. You're going to start with lower level things and then gradually work up. These kind of skills are part of advanced man training. Getting the child to be able to mand under the right conditions and to accept things that are problematic. Another area that occurs in schools too often is teaching the child to say no. And I've seen this in a lot of typical preschools. Tell him no. Well, there's a problem with that in that if a child hasn't learned to ask for what they want at first, teaching them to say they want something removed, or if they haven't learned, more importantly, if they haven't learned to cooperate, as Tim Vollmer said yesterday afternoon, if the child hasn't learned to cooperate and comply, and then we're teaching them to remove tasks, you're going to have a problem. You're not going to have a child who's going to cooperate with you. Teaching the child to ask to remove stuff is pretty complicated. That's an advanced man skill. It's not for infants. It develops early in infancy, actually, and it's pretty amazing that it does, because the word no is actually, the words yes and no are actually pretty complicated little bits of verbal behavior. Because is everybody here familiar with the terminology Mands, tax, interverbals, echoics? I sort of tried to define all of them except the interverbal. If I said to you, what are the words yes or no? What verbal operant are they? And Dr. Carbone, who's next door, has gone through this at this conference as well, the same drill. What are they? Many people will say, oh, they're intraverbals. Okay, and well, yeah, maybe a little bit. Somebody says something to you, you say something different, that's an intraverbal, but not primarily. Are they tax? They're not tax. What is a no? No. What is a yes? And they also are weird words that can't stand alone. If I walked into here and said, yes, what am I saying yes to? No. They have to relate to other verbal behavior. And I'm going to talk about the complexities of yes, no. They're autoclitics. Autoclitics are words that modify other responses, which is the autoclitic has a clear role in advanced man training. Motivation, I'm going to spend just a minute on this. Motivating operations work two ways. They establish the value of a reinforcer or they abolish the value of a reinforcer. They either evoke behavior or they abate behavior. And there's two main kinds of motivating operations. There are unconditioned motivated operations and conditioned motivative operations. Unconditioned motivative operations have to do with food, water, air, things that we need for survival. If we're deprived of things we need for survival, the passage of time makes them more valuable, and we will do something to obtain those things. If we're deprived of water, we become thirsty, and we're likely to do something to get water. Most of the things in life don't work that way. Most of the things we need in life are not based on survival. So there are things like chairs. I don't need a chair to live my life and survive. I'm not going to die if I don't have a chair. But if I've been walking around a lot and my legs get tired and I could just sit on the floor, but I have learned that sitting in a chair is comfortable and available so that when I'm tired, I look for a chair. It's conditions. It's something learned. I typically don't want a pen until I have to write. And I could never be deprived of a pen. Pens only become valuable when I need them for something else that I've learned. Those are conditioned motivative operations, and they work through changes in conditions. Somebody says to me, hey, sign this form. Oh, I need a pen. And the pen becomes valuable, and I do something to get the pen. Or there could be a set of worsening conditions where the environment is getting worse, and I've learned that when things get worse, I better do something to make sure that change in environment isn't happening. This is a conditioned motivative operation, reflexive, where you're walking in the aisle of the grocery store and you see somebody you don't want to talk to. The sight of that person establishes the value of getting away from the sight of that person, ducking into the next aisle, feverishly reading the label on a can, doing anything that'll get you out interacting with that person. So these motivative operations are central to all Mands. If we're going to understand how to teach a child to ask for what they want, we have to have a clear understanding of what wanting is. And as you hear me go through this, for those who are interested in the issues of intrinsic, extrinsic reinforcement, I think that those arguments aren't very useful. Yeah, perhaps there's stuff that's inside us that make us want something, that we're born wanting or that are part of who we are physiologically. What are we going to do about those things? We can't do anything about it. I can't get inside somebody, open up their head and, pour in some kind of juice that's going to change their intrinsic value of something. But when we look at wanting something as being the result of environmental conditions that we can systematically manipulate, that's optimistic. We could do something about it. Okay? So I really see the idea of motivating operations as being a major step forward in our understanding of human behavior and our ability to help people learn to do things under the right conditions. And it's central to teaching complex Mands. Okay, so motivating operations are a little bit complicated. Let me check the time here. we'll take a break in, like, what time's the break out here, 10:30? Until 10:30, okay. Okay, good. So I'll tell you what. I just went over the manding, okay? So what I'm going to do is after the break, we'll come back in about 15 minutes. I don't want you to miss the food out there. We'll come back in about 15 minutes, and I'll then talk about how that analysis I just went over of motivation fits into a more complex analysis of man behavior. Okay, enjoy your break. Okay. All right, so right before break, I was talking about the importance of motivating operations, and I want to get into that a little more detail here because it's important to consider several variables. We often talk about motivating operations as if there is a motivating operation in place. I am thirsty, water becomes valuable. Well, there's a lot of things that could go on. I could be in a situation where I'm hungry. I've not had food all morning, and it's getting close to lunch, and I didn't go out and have any snacks at break. So I've been food deprived, and food is valuable to me. And actually, my talking like this has just reminded me that food is valuable. I haven't had any food. I'm hungry. But guess what? I'm not going to run out and get food now, because there are other motivating operations in place, such as the value of having the opportunity to talk to all of you. So there's this multiple MOs in place at any one time. And what comes to strength is the one that correlates with multiple variables, such as what's going to provide me the easiest source of reinforcement? How hard is it to obtain some other reinforcer? What are the punishing contingencies that might arise? My walking out of here to get some snacks right now would probably not be smiled upon by my superiors, and certainly not by all my friends here in the room. So the idea here is that the motivation there are often multiple things that will come to play at one time. And the careful manipulation of circumstances to pull one motivating operation to the front so that you can teach that Mand has to be part of our consideration when we're instructing as well. How do we balance what aspect of the environmental relation is going to be important to us? So, in the Mand frame, the strength of the MO may alter the Mand response form. And I mentioned this earlier. Apple, when I just want an apple and I'm not really strongly in it, I might say apple. But when I'm cooking and I need to get that apple in the water right away so that the pie filling turns out perfect, I might say, give me the apple. Okay? The strength of the motivation may alter the Mand response form. Stronger motivating operations may lead to Mands being said faster and louder. Stronger motivating operations may lead to a Mand being shorter. Sit down, rather than, would you please sit down here? If motivation is stronger, it might lead to a more condensed Mand. Notice the way the variables related to motivation, how strong we want something, affects the form of the Mand. This has implications for what we're modeling for students and for our teaching procedures. Weaker motivated operations may be correlated with less strongly emitted Mand responses, and weaker motivative operations may lead to other variables more strongly altering the Mand response form. So in the situation where you don't want something very much, you might just say, cracker. You might just sort of mumble a little bit or say it haphazardly, or you might be more willing to accept being told no in that circumstance. So that's why you want to start with weaker MOs to teach skills such as accepting no, waiting, and so forth. As I said, the autoclitic is verbal behavior about verbal behavior. It alters the effect of the primary operant on the learner. Autoclitics generally are said to not be able to stand alone. So I wouldn't walk up and say, give me the. Everybody's like, on edge. What? Give me the what? The primary man never occurred. Give me the serves to inform the listener that the mand I'm emitting is this specific thing, and I would like you to deliver it by handing it to me, the give part. Okay? So these autoclitics alter the effect of the listener. They can't stand alone, and they can occur in a lot of different forms. They could be grammatical forms, like I just indicated. Give me the, I want a, please, may I have? Darn it, give me that right now. There could be all kinds of constructions that will get demand. And they also may involve the strength of emission. Ball! To get ball, where I say it strongly and forcefully. Or gestural kind of things. Give me the ball! You know, where you start moving quickly. All of these things modify the primary mand and are part of advanced mand programming. How do we get children to do the right thing at the right time? Well, how do we develop these autoclitics? Well, motivation can determine if a mand is emitted. It can also alter how the mand is emitted. And the primary operants must be acquired before autoclitics in most cases. We must learn to ask for apple before learning to say apple and do all those variations on the way we ask for apple. And it suggests that particularly for grammatical constructions, for the I want an apple, please may I have an apple, give me an apple, before we start having children respond in those complex forms, we probably want to make sure the child has a broad repertoire of primary mands. Apple, ball, dog, cracker, head drill, whatever the child asks for, they have a broad repertoire. The autoclitic control, where we're modifying that primary mand, I think, in our experience, in terms of so many of the children we've worked with, what we have seen is if we get that primary mand in place across lots of mands, the autoclitic modification seems to emerge without specific training. So in terms of advanced manding, one of my suggestions is teach a broad range of mands prior to starting to teach more complex recombinant manding or autoclitic mands. And make sure that you're never teaching anything rotely. People will want to teach the I want blank please phrase very early. And parents in particular want this because there's developmental research that shows children at age 1 year speak in one-word utterances. At 2 years of age, they speak in two-word utterances. Children at 3 years, 3 years utterances. So, oh my gosh, how can we make the child have more typical language development? Teach them to say more words. So now, instead of just asking for ball to get ball, they have to say, I want ball, please. But we're just teaching them to say more words in that case to make us feel better so that the child has more complex language. I think there are other ways of getting at more complex language than rotely teaching any response. The problem with teaching rote responses is you teach a rote response, what do you get? Rote responding. The child starts saying, I want cookie, please. I want ball, please. I've had many children who I've worked with who had been taught that way, and they won't ask for anything without saying, I want blank, please. That autoclitic frame becomes the only response because it's not really controlling the listener. It's not really telling the listener that I'm politely asking for this. As a matter of fact, it gets warped to the point where a child will say, when there's a very strong MO, the magnitude will change, and you hear a child ask for something in the lines of, I want water, please. It's very polite. They said, please, of course, politeness, the autoclitic isn't necessarily in those words. It's in how it is said. And then you also have a child where you ask them, what is it? And they will say, I want ball, please. They'll start tacting with that word because they're taught rotely. It happens all the time. Never teach anything rotely. Always have a purpose for what you're teaching, and think about the consequences of what you're teaching. If you want a child to use multiple words, each of those words should matter to the listener. So if I'm saying I should be able to learn to say, hey, I want the ball. Give me this. How about that? Now, how to teach those is a little complicated. How do you teach that autoclitic control? This is just a list of different ways one would say candy. And it sort of this slide basically covers what I've just said. Well, how is this autoclitic control developed? How do we develop that complex ability to engage in grammatical responses? And there's a lot of controversy over this. And I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not sure I have the answers to how this develops exactly. But I think there are some ideas derived from an analysis of verbal behavior that may have some impact on what we do. So first of all, there's this idea of parity, which I was talking to somebody about this after the break. If I said right now to all of you, I goed to Legends last night. My saying that, first of all, it has an effect on all of you of goad. That's not right. And when I said that to the person I was talking to, as soon as I said it, he scrunched up his face. There was immediate feedback on the omission of my behavior. It was punished. Okay? Right? So I said goad, and he looked at me with his face like, what are you saying that for? There's a second effect that happens, though. After, so what happens when the work of Ernst Mark, on analyzing the guided acquisition of second language. He was talking about some of Roger Brown's work on analyzing the development of language. And Roger Brown sort of said, well, there's a paucity of feedback to the children that reinforcement can't possibly guide their acquisition of grammar, for instance. And what Ernst Mark did was he looked at the Roger Brown's data, and in almost every instance when a child omitted something like I goad, the parents would say, yeah, you went there. The parents would provide some corrective feedback in the form of repeating the correct form. It wasn't reinforcement like the parent didn't give the child an M&M when they said went, or cuff the kid when they said I want. There wasn't punishing contingencies or something. It was this subtle guidance and providing a response that sounded right. What does that lead to in terms of the child's development? Well, what happens is the child learns when something sounds right. So at the point where I'm up here saying I goad, I have to struggle to say that because when I say it, it doesn't sound right to me. Okay? Another example of this is like music. And the person I was just talking to is a musician, and I know that. And when he's trying to figure out a chordal structure when he's playing a guitar, what happens is he doodles around, and then you get to the right chordal structure, and when it sounds right, that's what he does again. So the baby who's emitting all sorts of sounds, big da, tick tack, tick tack, tick 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 tick. The tick tick sounds right in relation to the tickle that was emitted as a mand. That origin of hearing the sound and then being able to repeat the sound, because here's what happens from the child's perspective. Being tickled is great fun. Hearing tickle, the word tickle, while you're being tickled, gets conditioned as a reinforcer. Therefore, when I say tickle, it sounds good to me too, and there's automatic reinforcement that doesn't require the intercession of another person. Why do we sing in the shower? Because it sounds good to us. It's automatically reinforcing. That is probably a lot of the same processes that are going on when children are learning to repeat what other people have said to them under conditions of reinforcement. So this has some significant implications. It means that we're going to have to basically provide models of what the child is going to say in certain conditions. We have to be able to provide guidance on what the child is going to say. So while the child is coming up and demanding for the ball, we're not going to prompt them to say, I want ball, please. We're going to say, yeah, you can have the ball. Here's the ball. Or when you're playing with the child and the child has the ball, throw me the ball. Give me the ball. We want the child to hear the constructions over and over under conditions of reinforcement so it develops this parity. That experience guiding the child's repertoire is so important. Okay. So basically what I'm suggesting here is do not directly teach autoclitics in the Mand frame. Build a large repertoire of Mands that control the listener first. And then continue to establish parity. Make sure you're modeling the appropriate Mand frames as often as possible so the child is as often as possible under conditions of motivation, under conditions where there's something of value and it's reinforcing to the child. Model that frequently so the child is hearing that, so that the form can get shaped up so they're likely to say that phrasing. Then, if the phrasing occurs in a situation where you'd reinforce a single Mand, and the right construction occurs where the child says, throw it here, that gets a little bit better throw. You're going to differentially reinforce those kind of responses. And, we want to avoid the carrier phrases, I've already said. And you also want to be careful not to teach yes, no too quickly in the Mand frame, because that'll be an autoclitic that'll override everything else. And you'll get, so I teach a child, do you want glasses? Yes. And the child gets glasses. Well, the child learns to say yes or no. What'll happen is the child will wait until they're asked, do you want first? That's a problem. Second of all, what gets the child the glasses is saying yes. And yes and no, the child will wait till be asked, and then they'll say yes or no. That'll block learning a broad repertoire of Mands. Thirdly, another issue that arises with this is the idea that the child saying yes or no can become part of other Mands, where every time you ask the child, or every time, the glasses here, and the child looks up and will say, yes, glasses. It becomes an odd autoclitic response, okay? So how do you teach yes-no Mands otherwise? Well, this is really a difficult challenge, and it involves, to some extent, tacting the status of your motivation. When somebody says to me, do you want some ice cream? And I say yes. That yes is autoclitic behavior about my tendency to demand for ice cream. What I'm saying is, I have motivation for ice cream, and if you put the ice cream in front of me right now, I would eat it. Yes, I want ice cream. That's sort of what the yes means. So in order to teach that, it involves a little bit of complexity here, in that the child has to have some ability to tact some internal state, which isn't a complex thing. Is ice cream at that time momentarily valuable to the child? And, the only way that I know to teach that is to look for these accompanying responses that may indicate that the child is hungry at the time for ice cream. If I hold up a little bit, does he come over? And I have to be sure in this situation, before I prompt the child to answer the question, do you want ice cream, that he wants it. Otherwise, I risk teaching under the wrong conditions and getting yes or no to occur, not when the child is saying they would accept it as a reinforcer. Notice the problem here. You don't want to teach this too early. Even though it develops early in usually the typical child sequences of learning skills, it's really a complicated skill to teach that you probably want to get a broad repertoire of single mands first. That seems to get the ball rolling for a lot of other things. And you also want to make sure that in teaching yes-no mands, you're going to avoid having the child get to the point where the yes becomes a part of all other mands. Okay. The next issue is, I talked about the idea of expanding language utterances. How do you get the child to speak in 2-3 word utterances? And is that a goal in and of itself? Well, basically my idea here, and it's not my idea, it's derived from other folks, is that, it's better to have an effective speaker. And single words can be way more effective than muddled 2- and 3-word utterances or rote 2- to 3-word utterances. But there comes a point where in manding, you do need to emit a more complex response that controls a variety of aspects of the reinforcer. So I don't always want just a ball. Sometimes I want the big ball. Sometimes I want somebody to bounce the ball, kick the ball, throw the ball, roll the ball. Sometimes I want them to roll the big ball, throw the little ball, tap the ping pong ball, dribble the basketball, and headbutt the soccer ball. That there becomes these different conditions of motivation that require my specifying a variety of aspects of the man's situation to the listener. So each component in a multiple component mand should have an effect on the listener and specify the reinforcer. Additionally, each component of the mand should relate to some specific aspect of my motivation. If it doesn't matter if I say red ball or blue ball, that either one will equally serve as reinforcing for me, it probably doesn't make much sense to teach red ball, blue ball at that point. There are other ways of getting across teaching the concept of color that might not lead to some other secondary issues that can arise. The idea here is that you want the child to have motivation for the specific thing. Okay, so basically, a multiple component mand would indicate that in the antecedent, there's motivation for a specific item, and the general response form will not immediately guide the listener to reinforce in that specific manner. And the reinforcer has definable characteristics that will effectively modify the mediator's behavior, the listener's behavior. So, and then a multiple component mand occurs, and the multiple component reinforcer is delivered. So you have motivation for a specific ball, the big red ball, because when that hits you, it sort of knocks you over, and that's fun being thrown back. And the little blue ball doesn't do that. So in that situation, the manned ball does not discriminate which particular ball is reinforcing, and the definable characteristics, big and red, will effectively guide the listener to deliver that specific ball. This is where you get multiple component mands, the language expansion to multiple words occurring in a way that is functional and allows the child to very carefully control their listener's response. So the prerequisite skill for teaching these multiply component mands include things such as a generalized manding repertoire respective of classes of various reinforcers. The child mands for ball and can and we'll use that to mand for big balls, little balls, squishy balls, etc. and they have a strong repertoire then, the next step is it really will help in this situation if you have taught some tags of features and functions, and you've taught tags of aspects of items such as their parts, their features. I want the police car. I want the taxi car. So that there are various items. And if the child has learned to tag that, and this is a point I'll get to in a little bit, there is an idea where once you have established a tact and conditions change where emitting that topography is altered to a condition where there's motivation for that item, the tact will easily be transferred to the Mands frame. And the idea here is that this is a benefit. You can often teach tacts pretty quickly for students who have learned to acquire tacts. The issue then becomes, how are you going to manipulate motivation so they want the thing they can tact? And then that transfer should occur readily. That's what I'm getting at here. So in the issue of getting the child to push the monster truck versus the tow truck versus the mail truck, you've got to teach, this is a mail truck. And these are the features of the mail truck. It has the mail symbol on it. It has a box body. And you teach the child to tact all those parts and features. It then becomes a readily acquired Mand if you manipulate where the tow truck has some special property that's motivating because you can put the Blue's Clues letter in it, for instance, or something, and you can't put that in the tow truck. Or the tow truck will pull the Thomas tank engine but won't pull any other item. So that saying tow truck is more valuable than saying some other truck. What I'm getting at here is the idea that you're teaching discrimination of components of things for which there is specific motivation. Notice the complexity of the Mand frame here, how these different components have to be accounted for in establishing our teaching procedures, and how it also is an issue here where teaching the Mand isn't solely an item or an issue of teaching I want it, I say it, I get it. It's also an issue of defining all of the variables that come together to teach a child to have a complex ability to very carefully control a listener in a specific way in relation to specific aspects of the motivation. So this teaching tax parts and features and then transferring to the Mand frame is important. Prior to teaching these component Mands, you want the teacher must contrive motivation, both for the general reinforcer and for the targeted characteristic. And we must consider what are some ways that we might strengthen the value of one item over another. And I just gave examples of that, such as the tow truck can pull Thomas the Tank Engine, and the mail truck can get the letter from Blue's Clues. Okay. Teaching procedures then for this involve contriving the right motivating operation in relation to both components, using a prompt procedure that will get the Mand to occur, that is not very intrusive, but strong enough to make sure the behavior will occur. Generally, that's going to be an echoic prompt. And sometimes, though, that you can call attention to the item by just pointing at it, which will serve as sort of an idea for the child to emit the tact that will prompt the child to transfer that to the Mand as well. And then you want to fade prompts. Remember that as I go through all this, that these multiply controlled Mands, particularly the tact to Mand transfer, as I've been talking about it, involve this idea of naming relations. And I don't have time to get into all the intricacies of what's called bidirectional naming. That is a whole area of research that's been published by a whole group of people, such as Kyle Miguel for one, that looks at the idea of if you learn a tact for an item, you will also acquire the listener response for it without specific teaching. So if I teach you to look at all the stuff on the table and I say, what is it? And you would all say, pitcher, right? And then I, without training, say to you, where is the pitcher? You'd probably look at the, pitcher. And you'll get the listener response just through being taught the tact response. There's a lot of analysis that underlies that phenomena. But it seems to happen regularly in most children. That once you teach the child to watch a ball being rolled and say ball, 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 the next time the child sees the ball, even though they have not been directly taught to tact it, they may engage in tacting. Okay? The literature seems to say that for speakers who have developed a range of tact responses, it's probably likely that the tact will occur before the listener response, which is contrary to what most people think. Because in this situation, if I said, get the bigger item with buttons, how would one solve that with all the things that are on the table? There's two remote controls up there. There's glasses. There's a lavalier mic. You're going to look around. Big remote with buttons. Big remote with buttons. Your tact guides your listener response through a phenomena called joint control. Well, the same thing can happen in the Mands frame, where you get this bidirectional phenomena where somebody has taught me that these are glasses. I need to see the screen. I look up, I see them. Oh, they're glasses. Glasses! And it leads to me transferring a tact to the Mands frame. Probably most early Mands are sort of learned in that way anyway, because you can't learn a Mand unless you've somehow looked at the person as they're looking at this and heard glasses as you are looking at it, and then something that manipulated the motivation for the glasses occurred. Okay, this multiple control involves lots of different things beyond the naming relation. As I already mentioned, the autoclitic, and then there's Mands for information and intraverbal manding as well. Okay, so I'm going to go skip this slide because I just went over it. And I'm going to also skip this slide and move to one more issue that I just mentioned, which was this issue of attention to the listener and getting that to occur. A student who is with you and realizes that you're a source of reinforcement is going to be much more likely to learn to acquire all sorts of Mands than somebody who doesn't regard their listener, who doesn't attend to or look at the listener. So to some extent, it becomes important to get the child to look at the listener, because by looking at the listener, that is providing the speaker, this child, information, or there's a stimulus change that has been correlated with the availability of some kind of reinforcer. The listener becomes a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcers. That has to be established. I look at the listener, and something about the listener tells me that if I ask him for him, I'm likely to get something. You know, it's sort of like the bartender effect. You know, the bartender carefully learns not to look at somebody, because if they look at somebody, that is known to be the case where somebody can say, yeah, I'll have a glass of Chardonnay. You know, because looking at the person will provide the opportunity for demand. We've all learned that. It all happens immediately and frequently in our repertoire. And it's a very important consideration. And it's a big deal in the field of autism. How do we get kids to give the right kind of eye contact? How do we get the child to look at me? Well, Dr. Carbone, who's talking in the next room here, has went over this a bunch of times, and you know he covers the idea that, well, okay, we want the child to look at us. How are we going to teach it? What do a lot of people do? Well, the first thing they might do is say, "Look at me." Oh, and it's always in that tone, but "Look at me," and they take the child's head and pop the child's head, sort of come up here, Dean. Dean, yeah, do you see that? Thank you for reinforcing an inappropriate manner. Look at me, and they take the child's head like that. And Dean loves that, right? And then I give him a cookie. Okay? That's one way that people often teach Mands. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, sir. You're laughing, and Dean's embarrassed, and I feel sort of crazy to me to do. Why do that? When was the last time somebody grabbed your face, pushed it towards you, and said, "Look at me," and then gave you an M&M? That's not why we look at anybody's face. I've been looking at all of you today, and nobody has done that yet to me. Okay, well, that's one way. Another way people teach Mands or teach eye contact is they take the M&M and they put it right here. Look at me, Okay, well, first of all, I don't look at people because they tell me to look at them. That's not why I look at people. I don't look at people's face because there's an M&M in the middle of their face. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. Why do we look at somebody's face? Well, it's because their face tells us something about their likelihood of delivering something of value to us. And when I say that, the reinforcer could be just their smile. It could be they're looking at us. It could be they're coming towards us. It could be delivering something that we've asked them for or talking to us in a certain way. The face becomes what's called a discriminative stimulus. It's discriminative for the availability of some reinforcer. How does that get established? Well, I don't really know that too well, but I will suggest that Ami Klin, who is here at this conference, has done work on eye contact and has talked about children who have autism preferring synchrony in visual presentation. So if you have a dancing figure that's dancing to the music, the child with autism follows it very, very carefully. And if some asynchronous event occurs, such as the dancer occurring out of rhythm, they don't attend to that. Okay? They prefer to look at the person's mouth when somebody's talking. Perhaps. This is, do I know this? No. Does Ami Klin know this? Roughly, he may suggest he does. It's a close call. At any rate, when the mother's mouth is talking, children with autism focus on the mouth, not on the eyes. But yet, when it comes to what aspect of the face best predicts what a person's going to do, like if right now I did this, you're looking at where are my eyes looking because it tells you something that I'm about to do. Oh, he's looking at his phone. He's checking the time. My eyes tell you something about what I'm going to do. You could, if I said, what am I thinking about? You're going to say, oh, probably the light because my eyes are there. The eyes tell us a lot about what a person is likely to do because they correlate. Why is that? Because what do we do before we do anything? If I'm going to walk off the stage right now, what do? I look over there. My first action is not even the turning of my trunk to move, it's my eyes turning. Our eyes are very predictive of people's responding. And if we don't follow the eyes, if our attention is on the mouth tells us very little. It's the eyes that are so important in predicting behavior. So how do we establish looking at the eyes is valuable? Well, there are two basic procedures that I'll go over. And they are, one, the face, establishing the face as a discriminative stimulus, and the other one is, that was iterated very neatly in an article by Dr. Carbone, is the use of a time delay in the Mands frame to also establish the face as a discriminative stimulus. First, let me go over Per Holtz's protocol, which he presented at this conference maybe 3 years ago. And hopefully he'll be back to talk about this in the future. What Per Holtz does is he establishes delivery of reinforcement to an individual. So I'll have a child, and I'll use an example that I used. I had this little girl, and she loved this elephant. It was like this elephant toy that ate these cracker kind of things. And I had the crackers. And she basically learned that I would give her the crackers. So to feed this elephant toy, and then the elephant would do crazy things once he had all the crackers. So I'd give her the cracker, and she'd take it. I'd give her another cracker, she'd take it. The next time, I'd give the cracker, and I'd just hold it. And she'd sort of reach, and I wouldn't give it, and I'd just wait. When she finally, that's extinction, right? Magnitude and variation. Now, with this protocol, you've got to be careful, because if it leads to variation in the form of aggression, it's too early to run this protocol, or you have to do something else. Okay? But in this case, the child started emitting other behaviors, such as looking up. When the child looks up at you, that's one variation in behavior. When that happens, what you do, nod, smile, and let go. That's all I do. I'm not saying anything. I'm just nodding and letting go. With this situation with that girl, the first time we ran it, it took 45 seconds for her to look at my face and do that. The next time, it dropped to, I think it was about, I don't have the data in front of me, about 19 seconds. The third time, 5 seconds. After that, she would almost automatically look up. She learned quickly that I look at his face, and his face tells me whether he's going to give me the cracker for the elephant or not. My face turned into, she was looking at me for the right reasons, so to speak. Luckily, this teacher learned the process and was able to follow through. And the child, who previously would not look at adults at all in the man frame, was frequently and very appropriately looking at people's faces to tell whether they'd deliver something when she asked for it. Okay, and that's the second protocol in the Mands frame. And it basically works sort of the same way. The child wants the ball. I present the ball. Child is motivated to get it. They want the ball. They say ball, and I don't deliver. I just wait until they look at you. When they look at me, I say ball and give it to them. My face, the trick here is to get your face to tell the person that you're going to be likely to deliver that item. And it's simply a fact where, or a process in which the response of looking at the face signals the availability of something else. And it's a simple procedure that is quite effective and doesn't involve all those things I talked about earlier, such as grabbing the face or putting the M&M at the eyeballs or look at me. That kind of stuff doesn't fly. So I sort of went through both these protocols. You can read them there. Okay, yes. So there is a difference between motivation and discrimination in the man frame that is important, that leads to certain implications for teaching more complex Mands protocols. Throughout our lives, we experience many situations in which things might be valuable but not immediately available. Okay, so we might want something, but we know we can't get it, so we wait until the circumstances arise in which we can ask for it to Mand. This, as I suggested earlier, is an important skill. The video I showed earlier of the child working at the coffee stand had a lot to do with this kind of distinction. Engaging in certain types of behaviors can change our environments to produce stimuli and improve how we're doing. That we wait for the right time and we ask for something, and things get better for us. It's part of our manipulating the world around us. So this leads to the protocol then for how do we Mand for things that are not immediately present? How do we Mand for missing items? And there is a slight difference here between spontaneous Mands and Mands for missing items that needs to be mentioned here. A Mand that is completely spontaneous, is driven strictly by motivation, occurs without regard for any current environmental event. These kind of things are weird. We don't often, like if I all of a sudden ask somebody, say, halupki. I ask for a halupki. You know what a halupki is? Stuffed cabbage, Polish, Slovak food. Okay, halupki. I mean, that would be weird, my asking for a halupki out of the blue. We don't do things like that. Usually it's in a case where we're in somebody's kitchen and they're cooking and they're able to, and we know they have halupkis available. There's a lot of conditions that lead us to ask for that specific thing in that specific circumstance. Spontaneous mands are rather rare. And when they do occur, they're usually more magical than anything. And Skinner talked about magical mands, such as my trying to get something done and having a problem, and I'm not able to find what I want, and I say, my kingdom for a horse. What's that from? Dave Palmer uses that. It's from some literary thing where my kingdom for a horse. Where, who's going to give him the horse? Where's the horse going to? It's like this mand out of the blue that can never have been reinforced before that occurs. I mean, those are sort of like spontaneous mands that don't have much discriminative control. There's nothing in the environment that controls emitting that mand, and it couldn't have been reinforced before. Those things are weird. Most mands are more likely to be controlled by immediate conditions in the environment that relate to the motivation. There's some discriminative control. And so how do we go about teaching these mands for missing items? These when you need something and it's not there. How do we teach that? Well, it depends on other stimuli and frequently accompany the reinforcing events and establishing those right conditions. So in the mand for a missing item, there's an MO for some terminal reinforcer. You set up a chain of events that lead to one response being reinforced by something else. That reinforcement is a discriminative stimulus for the next step in the chain. And then you do the next behavior. The next change occurs that is a reinforcer for your last behavior, but then serves as the SD for the next behavior, such as I want to pour water into the cup. I look at the pitcher. Looking at the pitcher is reinforced by seeing the pitcher. Seeing the pitcher is also not only a reinforcer for having looked at it, but it's discriminative for the next step of grasping the pitcher. Grasping the pitcher reinforces my reaching, but is also the discriminative stimulus for the next step of picking up the pitcher, which reinforces, and all of this flows smoothly, and we do so many things with these kind of chains of stimulus response occurring. And life is good when we learn such chains, but every once in a while there's a missing link, and then there's a problem that needs to be solved. That problem, so I go to pour the water, and the lid is not on correctly. All of a sudden I have a problem. I got to figure out how to get the lid on correctly. The lid not being on correctly, allowing pouring, establishes the motivation to do something about that. And if I don't know how to do that, I might look to my buddy Dean and say, "Hey Dean, can you fix the lid?" It might lead to emitting a mand. I go to get in my car, I tap my pocket, my keys aren't there. Where are my keys? It leads to a mand. Okay? Those are the components, the basic ABCs of a mand for a missing item. There has to be this correlation between a series of events and then an item that is typically providing reinforcement for some previous response is not currently available. That establishes the motivation in the moment to obtain that access to that next step. That then leads me to say, hey, where's my keys? Notice it's a funny relation because it helps, and I'm going to cover this here real quickly, it helps if I could tact all the steps in the chain. If I could tact pitcher, handle, lid, water, glass. Because then if any one of those steps are out of sync, there's motivation for something I already know the name of, and it comes to strength. Notice that this suggests that there are relations in between programs related to the current program. In other words, I am building skills from the earliest moments of instruction that are leading to these more complex skills emerging. I'm teaching parts and features of the picture. I'm teaching tacks of action, pour, grab, twist, open. All of those lead to this kind of development of complex mands for missing items. Another thing that comes to play in this protocol of teaching these mands for missing items is the idea that you want to be clear that it doesn't become predictable that a certain step is going to be missing. If every time I'm going through this chain of responses and it's the lid that's off, before I even start, I'm going to say, fix the lid. That's not a mand for a missing item. That's a direct mand for something that you've learned is going to predictably happen. So if we're teaching this, sometimes I go through the whole chain and nothing happens. It works fine. Other times I go through the chain and it's the lid or the glass. The glass is missing, or the whole picture is somewhere else. So it's not predictable what step is going to lead to the mand. That is why having all of those tacks for all of the components in the process established first is so valuable. So basically, this is what's called a condition-motivated operation transitive within a behavior chain. The presentation, and it's an interesting kind of chain because it involves, you get to the point where the glass isn't there and the motivation is for the glass, but what might lead to the mand is sort of the tacting of the absence of something, which is a pretty complex analysis that involves having previously tacted it there and giving the autoclitic response. Oh, I would tack the glass if it were there, but it's not there. There's no glass. Oh, glass, I need a glass. Okay? Sort of complicated stuff here that relate to the idea here of sequences of instruction, teaching previous skills first so that it easily guides responses, and also, and I think I'm going to show this video again soon. I will in just a minute. The idea of the interrupted chain not leading immediately to the mand. Okay? Sometimes you want to teach problem solving in there too, and I'll go over that in just a minute. Okay. So you want to start with highly reinforcing activities. Start with a chain that is independently acquired. You need the child to be able to independently complete the task first. If you have to prompt the child through the chain, they're probably not ready to teach missing items for that chain, number one. Number two is when I say independently, when to teach these chains, you want to teach without verbal prompts. You don't want to tell the child, put your hand on the pitcher, pick up the pitcher, pour from the pitcher. You don't want to teach them verbally because then the child, when a problem arises, is going to look over and wait for you to tell them what to do. That's what happens in so many work situations for individuals. They don't know what to do and they just sit there and wait for somebody to tell them what to do. You want them to do it all independently, and then when a problem arises, you want to sort of just gently guide them to look somewhere else or to emit some other response to solve the problem before they mand. In the situation with the coffee cup, as you're going to see in just a minute, I'm going to re-show that video, how it was taught, just like I'm saying. The teacher taught all of making a cup of coffee through that stimulus response chain process, did it with nonverbal prompting, did not tell the child what to do, ran a separate program in which the child learned to tact all the actions, all the parts. So he can tact creamers. He's learned that. He could also tact the Keurig. He could tact the actions of putting it in. He could tell somebody the steps of what he's doing. All of that was established. So notice all of the foundations for the cathedral that were built before the child puts on the steeple of being in a situation where the task is a little thrown off. and he has to solve the problem. How did that guy learn to look around? I mean, to me, that was one of the most important parts of that protocol. The child looking around and solving it first, because that's what happens in the real world in job situations. What happens for a lot of the students we teach in job situations, what do? They're putting together widgets, and a widget's missing, and there's no widget. They sit there, and they wait for somebody to tell them what to do. They don't mand. They don't engage in some response to try to solve the problem. All of that was circumvented in this case by teaching the skill of trying to figure it out on your own. And then when you can't solve the problem, that's when you mand and you initiate. It's not somebody else coming up to you. Which, by the way, for the teachers who are out there, one of the things that happens with mand training that is the hardest thing to get across in schools is the idea that we are actually teaching the child to initiate. That's weird. Most instruction in schools goes, the teacher talks and the child responds. The teacher says do this and the child does it. We often don't consider procedures and activities that are going to lead to the child talking first and coming up to the child. So that when we're doing some of that early mand training, it looks odd in schools. You have to prepare administrators to know that you're going to be mand training so that they can see the value in initiation as a sequence of skills that leads to this kind of problem solving. Sorry for that aside. So, this data collection in the mand frame, you would use a form that basically iterates what is already reinforcing to the student, what do you establish as becoming valuable in the chain, what then do you prompt and how do you fade those prompts, and what did the child do? These are basically those steps again. And I sort of went through all of these chains here, so I'm not going to cover this. I'll just show the video again, and you can watch here and see the coming together of multiple repertoires. How was this man taught? I asked at the beginning of the training. Well, it was taught through all those things I just said. Teaching the task, teaching interrupted chain, teaching this individual to have a broad repertoire of single mands, teaching the child to have multiple component mands. Being able to ask for the stirs, the coffee filters, all of those kind of things. So anyway, here we go. By the way, there's also some textual responding. He learned to read the order. And, probably what's going on here is another protocol I didn't talk about is we also teach children to talk to themselves through teaching what's called joint control procedures. We teach the tact, and we teach the child to be verbally present, to echo what other people said. So this would be the procedure for multiple listener response discrimination. So give me the ball, the cat, and the dog. How would we teach a child to give those in the right order? And we teach it by the child echoes. Dog, cat, ball, dog, cat, ball, dog, cat, ball. And then those echoics guide the tact response, which then guides the listener response. So my guess is, and this is back to that interpretive science slide I showed, he's probably talking to himself throughout this process. He's probably saying, next is going to be the creamer. Where's the creamer? Creamer. He's probably repeating creamer to himself as he's looking. Where is it? Is it under here? Just to give another layer of skills that were taught prior to all this coming together. What's beautiful about this is it's such thoughtful behavior. He looks so deliberate. And it's a result of beautiful teaching on the part of his instructors. And what he actually says is, I can't find the creamers. It's really, it's just a beautiful example of complex manding coming together under the right conditions, under the right control. Here's another one, though, that is also a complex task to get into, and that is, how do you teach a child to mand to other students, to other children? Okay? I often talk about this. It's an odd relation. I have some friends who are from Great Britain and England specifically, and their children grew up in America. What's odd, or it's not odd, it's what happens all the time, it's been demonstrated across lots of circumstances, is that the children of my friends who speak with very pronounced English accents don't speak with English accents. They speak with American accents. How did that happen? Why is that? Well, if you think about it, there's probably great value in learning to speak like your peers speak, because it's your peers who you're competing against on a day-to-day basis and who you'll be involved with in cooperative and competitive relations throughout your life. It's probably going to be most effective to learn to talk like your peers talk. Okay? So that probably has something to do with it. That's hypothetical on my part, but it makes a lot of sense. But what happens when a child doesn't interact with peers? How do they learn these critical skills of talking to the very people who they're going to need to talk to throughout their life? You know, sadly enough, the generation above is going to be gone at some point in their life. People who they really need to learn to talk to are other children their age. How does that happen? How do we teach that? Well, and it's a conundrum to a certain extent, because at first, for many children, they're not very good at guiding other children's responses. They don't know a lot of the stuff that we've just talked about in this session, how to deliver reinforcement immediately, how to differentially reinforce when the child says ball when they want ball versus frisbee when they want the frisbee. Children, and they're also not very patient to wait around till the child says ball. They're also not going to manipulate motivative operations to get the child to want stuff so the child learns to ask different things. So you end up in this circumstance where the child rarely goes to other children because it's not effective to do so, because they've only been taught how to mand with adults. Peer-to-peer manding becomes really important. We've had sessions at this conference devoted just to that topic by a friend and colleague, Rachel Kittenbrink, and I believe they're archived on the website. I would advise you to watch those archive sessions. It's really helpful. But anyway, how do you go about doing this? How do you get peer-to-peer manding going? Well, I think it requires teaching other students to effectively reinforce peers. And the protocol must address the value of giving something to someone else. We have to reinforce the other children for reinforcing another children when they emit demand. And it may be easier to teach using typically developing peers as listeners, because they're more likely to be able to follow the rules of mand training. Let me show you some of these videos here in just a second. We begin the process when the student has acquired the ability to mand to adults. Why? Because if the child lacks a mand repertoire, we have to teach mands in a structured fashion, and it's going to be adults who are going to be most able to do that. As soon as the child has developed a range of mands to adults and is emitting them efficiently, we then begin training the listener as the first step to deliver the reinforcer. The first step is teaching the other person how to be a mand trainer. That's the first step. That's often the case in most behavioral procedures. You don't start with the student, you start with setting up the environmental conditions. In this case, the environmental condition that is relevant is the behavior of some peer. So you got to teach the peer what to do. You teach them how to reinforce, you teach them how to deliver the reinforcer immediately, and you have them become willing participants in the manned frame. The next step then is to prompt the child to man to the peer who is willing to deliver the reinforcer. This has to be very subtle. It has to be very, it also has to be effective in getting the child to man. Along with this, you're also concerned about something else. Your tendency as staff training this procedure is going to be to reinforce the child for manding to a peer. So when the child goes up to the other child and says, ball, the child delivers and when the child delivers the ball, you're going to say, that was nice asking. That's generally not a good idea in the manned frame, because we don't want the child to ask the peer to get the reinforcer because you've cheered for them. We want them to ask for the ball to the other child because they get the ball. That's what it's about. So make sure that you're attentive to that variable. What you may need to do is set up systems where you can reinforce the listener, the person who delivered the reinforcement for the mand. That's where that person gets something good out of it for being a reinforcer to the other child, the child who's learning to man to peers. This also involves careful consideration of another variable. Setting it up so that the person who is delivering the reinforcer, the child who is going to be the listener, the grantor of demand, if you so to speak, so that that person is not simultaneously being taught to give up something that they don't want to give up. So you don't want to start with the child going up to mand to a child playing over there for the ball when that ball is that other child's favorite thing. You want to figure out what is it that this child can give this child that isn't so valuable to that child, but yet is valuable to this child, to the child who's going to admit demand. That is a complex set of relations, again, that requires some preparation and planning in advance and checking that out. Okay? You're eventually going to start this in pretty structured settings and eventually get the child manding to lots of different peers across lots of different situations so that eventually the child develops the generalized spread of mands to peers, so that going up to peers and asking for things becomes a generalized source of reinforcement. It's good to ask peers for things. Notice that this requires a whole set of teaching procedures that teach children in the class that there's value in doing good things for other people. Sort of like teaching altruism, if you will. But it's procedurally doing so. It's doing so because there's something good in it in giving it to somebody else. And you're going to set up those kind of reinforcers at first. And what you eventually see happening is children will interact with each other because there is value in the interaction that ensues as a reinforcer. Let me show you some videos on this. Here is a very early stage in the process, and it's not a perfect video, but... So here I am. This is the very first time this child has ever manded to another child. He has acquired at this point, I believe, somewhere in the range of 100 or so mands. And there was some food that we deliberately gave to the other student. And I had spent about 10 minutes working with the little girl who delivers the reinforcer, explaining, when he comes over, you do this, and going through all this. So that I don't capture on this video. Now I'm in the process of prompting. And my prompts at this point are pretty intrusive. They have to be because this child has never done this before. So here's what it looks like then. There was a complexity there that I didn't take into consideration. Remember what I said earlier? There are multiple MOs in place. He was having fun with the balloon, the car, the sight of the car changed his motivation, even though that food, if he had, quote unquote, known, if there had been a history of going over to her and getting the food, he would have ran over to her and got the food. So those are all variables you got to work through, the balancing of which motivation. And I had no way of anticipating that his motivation would be so flimsy that it would change to car in that moment. But he eventually came in contact with the food, which is a good thing. So here is another video, maybe a little bit later. I think a little bit later that same day.
You want to do that again? Yeah. Okay. You can have a piece of cereal here.
A little bit of coaching for the listener.
This is for you guys for training.
What's he going to say? When he says cereal, what do you do? Yeah, that's it, girl.
She's got a little bit of rule-governed behavior there. And now it's direct prompting. Notice the change already. And I didn't have to say as much to him the second time as that time. And let's see. Well, anyway, I'm going to just jump to this video because simply because it's so cute. But actually, there is a more important reason. This is the kind of stuff that happens when you do a good job with man training. And these are two peers interacting. He's saying bead to ask for a bead. By the way, this student on your right is non-vocal, primarily a signer. This is all the result of pairing and working things out, getting the right students to interact. And watch this protocol, accepting no. Now he takes his data. Okay. I have two more protocols to go through, and I'm not sure I'm going to have time to get through both of them. But I'll go over this real quickly. Mands for information. Watch the presentation by Alice Schoensberg yesterday. She gives a good introduction to this and talks about some important issues related to this. Basically, you have to make sure that the reinforcer for a mands for information is information and not the item. So if I teach a child, if I hold up a bag and the child says, "What's in it?" and I reach in and give them the item that's in it, it's not the information that's reinforcing the man. It's the wrong man. The child should be asking for the bag or directly for the thing inside. I want the child to be able to ask what's in it, so when I say ball, the child can say, "Oh, I need the basket," and reach over to get the basket. Or there's something that knowing what's in the bag makes it more valuable. So I should have cut in this video, but we have a video of a little girl who is told, "Go water the plants." And she dutifully runs into the bathroom and there's no watering can. And she says, "Where's the watering can?" And the answer is, "Oh, it's on the shelf." Well, the only way on the shelf is going to serve as a reinforcer if she's been taught the preposition on, and when shelf controls which part of the room she goes to. All of those things have to be taught first. So I'm not going to go through this whole protocol. It's actually would take quite a bit of time because I want to get to finish up with the conversational kind of Mands here. But the idea is that a Mand for information should result in information being of value, not getting the exact thing. Okay? Briefly. Well, anyway, and here's a treatment integrity sheet that's modified from the Carbone Clinic on teaching Mands for information. But this conversational Mand is a problem. And Dr. Alice Schillensberg talked about this a little bit yesterday. And it's a challenge of why would a child want to converse with another person? Why would a child want to ask you about what you did last night or what movie you saw or what the character did? Well, something, most of us don't engage in conversations with somebody who we're not interested in the topic. We cut it off pretty quickly. If somebody's talking about for me, talking about, for instance, some show on swapping houses is not an interesting topic for me. I just won't carry on a conversation about that too often. But if somebody starts talking about animal behavior, wow, I'm down with that, and I'm going to ask questions, and I think we're all sort of that way. So the issue is, how do we get the right control for these motivated variables in conversation so that there's something in it for the child in talking to another person? And the motivation shouldn't be that I ask you, what movie did you see last night in order to get an M&M? That's not why we do it. We got to get the right motivation. And how do we do that? Well, I'm going to talk about a procedure that was tried out by some of our consultants in our program, people who are my heroes in a lot of ways. Specifically, Jolynn Jackson had a lot to do with this. As some of you are aware, through the work of, again, Dr. Carbone and others, we have implemented a procedure for teaching intraverbal webbing, where we establish a wide range of first tags of features, functions, and classes of items that lead to the child then being able to engage in intraverbals about those tags. So we teach the child that glasses have an arm, shirts have an arm, a jacket has an arm, there might be an arm on a Ferris wheel, and we'll teach the child to answer questions such as, what has arms? And the child starts, an octopus. And what is an octopus? It's an animal. And where does it live? In the sea. What else is in the sea? Fish, coral. And we end up teaching the child these webs of knowledge that look something like this. So here's a child who knows vehicles, and they know that a car is a vehicle, they know a school bus is a vehicle, they know parts and features, and the arrows indicate either bidirectional knowledge or one way. So in this case, the child can say that a boat has a sail, but if you ask a child what has a sail, they don't yet say boat. But if you ask a child what has wheels, they'll say a train. What does a train have? They'll say wheels. That's what the bidirectional arrows mean, as opposed to the one-way arrow from boat to sail. And this is a web, and we set up materials that a box of pictures that the child has, this knowledge web with all these tabs that direct the child to begin getting the child to engage in answering questions in a conversational manner. But it's not really a conversation, because a conversation is sort of a dance. Most conversations, there's a lot more to it than what I'm saying, of course. But for the most part, in a conversation, you talk, you say something, the person answers you, they answer a question. How does that motivation move in a conversation? What are these shifts and changes in conditions that alter motivation? Well, basically, what Jolynn did was she set up a circumstance where she talks to a child with an intraverbal web. And she makes sure that she's entering into this web topics that are of high interest to a student. Then, when the high interest topic occurs, there's a pause in sort of the asking of questions on the part of the teacher, and the teacher in that pause will make a statement that relates to something of interest to the student, but not about the student, but about the teacher, and doesn't say anything. Since the topic is so interesting to the student, there's this, hearing what the teacher says, because it will relate to a motivative operation that is strong in the student, in other words, talking about things they like to talk about, that pause in the flow of things establishes the value of hearing the teacher talk about what about what the student is actually interested in. Okay? So that then should lead to demand. And generally, what Jolene has done is she's not directly prompting demand. If after a pause the child doesn't respond, the teacher will make some brief statement and move on. In other words, you're not going to teach this protocol until the child has developed all the skills related to Mands for missing items, has strong intraverbal webbing, you've been able to clearly identify lots of topics that are of interest to the student, because you're going to need several topics to get this going. Otherwise, it'll become a rote response that, you can never do the same sequence twice, in other words, because it's not good conversation. What did the Irish say? The crack is good. The crack is not good if you're talking about the same thing over and over. It's when you're talking about something new that's interesting. So anyway, here we go. Here is an example of this.
Of the flowers. You said you're selling flowers for Boy Scouts. So tell me some of the flowers that you're selling for Boy Scouts.
Whatever those red ones are called, the thorny ones, the rose bush.
The what?
Rose bush. The cat. No, not rose bush. Like the red ones, like the red kind of flowers. The red.
You mean roses?
Yeah, roses.
And what else? You said white ones?
Yeah, white ones.
Well, I know the name of the white ones.
What?
It's the lily.
Notice how quickly that occurred. I think she said, I know some flowers that are white ones. Which ones are these? And he quickly asked. Let me show you one more video, and we'll end on this one here. I'm going to jump in. I think it's a little bit later on. I'm going to go right here. Here we go.
All right, so let's talk about vacations at the beach. So, which beach do you go to?
Myrtle.
Oh, I go to a different beach.
Which do you go to?
I go
Boom.
to
Where do you go
beach
to?
at-
That, by the way, that video occurred after lots of different opportunities for this child to talk about lots of things. And this day he was interested in the beach. He knows all the webs about going to the beach. She stops and says, I go to the beach. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, which one do you go to? And you see that natural flow. It looked like a pretty natural conversation. I could tell you that 2 years prior to this, those parents would have been crying if they had seen this child do this. It's phenomenal outcomes that look like magic watching a brief flow. It looks like, oh, that child can do that anyway. But the child couldn't do it anyway. It was the result of artful teaching, carefully planning sequences of instruction, integrating instruction, and knowing those basics of how do you manipulate antecedent conditions? What are the behaviors that you're looking for? What are the consequences? And then those principles, motivation, discriminative control. How do you get all of those things to come together to get an individual to have a skill like that is so flexible, so adaptive, and it's going to result in him having a lot more meaningful, important interactions in the future. This teacher, Kristen Seneca, and the consultants that work there, to me, are worth their weight in gold. That's changing the world in the right direction. Thank you very much, and I'm willing to stick around for a while if there are questions. I'd be happy to address them. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference, folks.
Thank you, Mike, so much. Let's see here. Anyone, please, if you're seeking social work CEUs, you must sign in and out daily at the registration desk. Please complete an evaluation of this session through the conference website. The session number is 20, and this was Mike Miklas. The session code for this, which everyone is waiting for, is HOP, as in Happy Open Paul 652. Once again, HOP 652. And as Mike said, he'll be around for a little bit, so thank you very much. Have a great day.